Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Evening, local politics fans. It's the last chance for us to dig into council business before everyone starts to pack up and go on holiday. So, yes, we have a packed agenda of all things good that are coming to the council chamber this Tuesday for us to give you the almost like the match of the day highlights before the match even kicks off. So, how are you, Simon?
Yeah, I'm doing fine, thanks, Ian. It's we've got the kind of the end in sight, as you say, for the summer, but yeah, I'm doing okay. If anybody can hear any kind of motoring noises in the background, I don't think you can, but that will be because some people seem to think that we live in Brands Hatch.
Yes. Unfortunately, the entire Cosham Drayton side of the hill kind of has become, over the last few weeks, has become a regular racetrack for motorcyclists. And despite multiple angry posts by neighbours and local councillors expressing their concern, it would seem, despite the fact that they gather at the appropriate time, okay, everybody, see you at 6 o'clock while we're going to drive irresponsibly. At the moment, the police seem somewhat powerless to intervene. And we've spent our summer is being played out to the background of racing motorbike noises, which I don't think is making either of us particularly warm and fuzzy, is it, Simon?
No. I just hope that everybody keeps safe, because it sounds like they're not really driving that safely, to be honest. But there we go. Anyway, moving on.
Indeed. So this episode, one more episode. We've got an absolute blockbuster next week, haven't we? We have the man himself, Steve Pitt, is coming to join us for an insight into life as council leader. But before then, what's on the agenda for this week's council?
So the agenda for the full council on the 18th. There's some things there that we wanted to talk through. Our normal thing is going through the notices of motion, which is where the various groups on the council have submitted things for the council to discuss. Funny enough, the first one, which is item 10A on there, is neighbourhood policing matters, which is by Councillor Lee Hunt and Councillor Darren Sanders from the Lib Dems. Good grief, that can't possibly be relevant. So essentially this motion talks about how the Hampshire and Isle of Wight constabulary serving Portsmouth is disadvantaged by the current funding formula, and the claim there is that it's underfunded to the tune of nearly £42 million compared to the national average. That the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Police Federation have commented that Hampshire and Isle of Wight is underfunded to that amount, and stating that its members say that morale is low. So the motion is calling on also for notes that it's regretful that successive police and crime commissioners have closed police counters across Portsmouth, including the ones in Cosham, Southsea, North End, and City Central, and now the only publicly accessible counter is on the airport industrial estate, to which you have to have a car or bicycle. You have to have your own transport to get to, because it's not served by any public transport. That the Police and Crime Commissioner precepts in recent years, in 2021 it was 7.1%, and in recently it was 6.34%. Noting that the council concerns that despite ongoing police precept increases at police and public meetings across Portsmouth, residents describe how, and I'm quoting, nothing seems to have changed. How they are kept waiting on 101, which is indeed something that was mentioned when we went along to a local police and Crime Commissioner meeting in Cosham, on the Highbury estate, where Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, Donna Jones, was present. And then a couple of weeks late after that, we had her deputy Terry Norton onto the show to talk about that. Cites about there being some good stuff, which is about the investigation into high harm, county lines, crimes, citywide safeguarding cameras, and the creation of a permanent post within the current budget of a specialised antisocial behaviour officer. But fundamentally, it's saying antisocial behaviour across the city is overwhelming our local neighbourhood policing teams, and therefore the council invites the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Chief Constable to a future meeting at the council to inform the council about the current state of recruitment and retention for police staff and PCSOs, and specifically how many extra police each part of the city is going to be getting, how neighbourhood policing is going to be involved. This should be through the extra neighbourhood policing officers, and that should be reflecting people's priorities, how 101 is going to be improved, and how they will open accessible police public contact counters in the accessible locations in the north and the south of the city. So essentially it's saying, hey, antisocial behaviour is a thing. There have been some things that are a bit better, but the money that you've asked for, that's a share of the council tax payments or the total council tax bill, has gone up. What's happening with that is essentially kind of what this motion is saying.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting motions, isn't it? Where we call upon the council to change something that's outside of the council's control, but I think there are some nuances and subtleties to this, and it feels a little bit of a machine gun approach to sort of well, there's this and there's that and there's. So I mean, I struggle a little bit with they closed down the police stations. Well, ultimately, the reason for that will be funding, and will be a case of, well, yourself, if you've got small teams dotted all about the island, those premises have to be kept open, they have to be staffed, they have to be heated, lit, and obviously there is now the major centre in Airport Service Road that was referenced. It's just a more efficient way to police the city. The kind of it all feels a bit 1970s, that there should be a desk that you can go and talk to somebody. Well, I get that when you had to go to the call box at the end of the road with your 10p pieces to call someone, but really, is that really a thing? I'm not sure that it is. But the antisocial behaviour thing, if I just change tack very quickly, that came up in all of the hustings this year, didn't it? And appeared to be a hot topic with every councillor and every prospective councillor that we spoke with. But I'm not sure that I it feels like the answer, because I think we asked a few questions, didn't we, about is it enforcement or education? And I felt like the vast majority of those folk weren't looking for strict enforcement.
Well, I mean, I think antisocial behaviour is you can probably take that as simplistically or as complexly or as complicated as you want. On one side of the argument, it's quite simply because there isn't enough of a visible police presence and a deterrent. Therefore, to be honest, people keep, for want of a better phrase, keep pushing their luck and get more and more confident. I could use the word confident. Other people might use words like Larry.
Yes.
And more of a nuisance. So there could be that. There's all, from the other end of the argument, there's the what alternatives are there for, if because not all antisocial behaviour is from groups of young people, for example. Are there other things that are there other social events or things that places that they can go where they can effectively entertain themselves or use their time more effectively. So I think there's kind of different things around that, and some of that is about organisation, some of that is about funding. But I think the thing that kept coming up from the members of the public that we heard from, and indeed at that public meeting, was it just seems that there isn't enough happening to be that deterrent, to stop it. And it feels that the police teams that we have are very, very stretched. They're working very, very hard, but they're fighting fires. I mean, not literally, obviously. That's a different department, but they're having to kind of run around trying to kind of do all of these things. But at the same time, we can't hark back to the times of the 70s, for example, where you'd have this kind of nostalgic memory, whether it's true or not, of there being a local bobby that you knew the name of that was on every street corner or whatever. That those times have gone, and there are other ways, much more effective ways for our police to be exercising their role in society, which was some of the things that Terry Norton was talking about. When he was on the show. So there was a lot of that about that, but alongside that, there is that fundamental frustration of when you call through to 101, because it's not, it might not necessarily be an urgent crime, or it might not be a crime in progress, but that intelligence of those things happening, there's all these ways where you can feed that information into the police. You can email them. You can, go to their website or to their app. You can email, all of those ways. But if there's no officer at the other end to interpret that information within a short time scale, the opportunity, and that was one of the examples that was cited from one of the local residents on the Highbury estate, wasn't it? Was that they observed something happening on their driveway, and actually because kind of a follow up wasn't kind of took up in time for that, one of their neighbours actually had their car stolen. So it's those kind of, I think it's those kind of things. Maybe people are seeking the in person if they feel that they can't get through any other way, but there will be a lot of people that are quite happy to report digitally. And
I mean, it's a much bigger question, and I think there is, if I look at our current predicament that we have here with the antisocial behaviour of the bike racers, the bike racers will meet every Thursday and every Saturday, 6 o'clock at the tax office. They will then race their motorbikes, along the hill, from the Hillsey roundabout up to IBM, through Paulsgrove, up across the top of the hill, back down through Drayton, and they're going to do that from 6 o'clock till 11 o'clock. They make, or later, they make no secret about that. There is no shame in what they're doing. There is, it is, and the police have been present, but it's not a visible deterrent. And I do wonder whether, there is, as you say, there is an element of, the police being a visible deterrent. But I think the world has moved on, and the I know my rights, you can't touch me. I don't think it would actually matter how many police officers you had. I think societally there isn't that. There is, and again, I'm probably going a bit deep here, but I do wonder whether, it doesn't matter how many officers you get. If people aren't going to respect and behave reasonably, and B, and I've brought this up before, and I know I'm going to sound like a Daily Mail reader, which I don't, but you only have to look at in the courts, in the Portsmouth Evening News, to find, somebody who's robbed a dozen convenience stores and threatened the staff with pointed instruments and, with violence, and they get a 10-week custodial sentence. They'll be out in 5. There is an element of the one I was reading the week. The person was caught dealing Class A drugs in Commercial Road in 2021. He eventually was jailed for 4 years after they found a lot of Class A drugs in his house. the aside at the end was, oh, and he'd been arrested for dealing Class A drugs, at sort of 6-month periodic intervals up until that trial. And so I kind of, you talk about police morale being low. You catch somebody brazenly, openly dealing Class A drugs, you find their supply, you take it off them. It takes 2 years to come to court and they get a custodial sentence. But in the meantime, they're making their living dealing Class A drugs. It must feel like trying to, it's a we in the sea, the ability that the police have to A, stop this, and B, they catch the criminals and the courts slap them on the wrist.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole
It is a whole other thing. Yeah.
That's a whole other thing. I mean, like you say, the sentencing is something even further out of the council's remit. But from a point of view of what this motion does, once you kind of get through all the, obviously the wording of how that kind of makes its case, but essentially it's saying, hey, can we have some updates on what's happening with these things? I mean, that seems quite a, to be honest, on the face of that, that seems quite an eminently reasonable thing. What we see in the later motions, though, is interestingly enough, the actions that this motion's calling for doesn't set a time limit for that meeting to happen.
No. So I think perfectly reasonable to ask the question, how are things going? When's 101 going to be fixed? As you say, in our deeply probing, investigative, journalistic way, we discussed that with Terry Norton, who accepted it wasn't as it should be, and that's many months ago. So I think, for me, it's not a bad motion to ask the questions. I think it does set up a few. Or isn't it terribly sad that the horrible Conservatives cut all the police numbers? Well, yes, we can all do our head shaking at that, and wouldn't it be better if? But I think the some of the premise that's being sort of hinted at there, which is if only there were lots more police officers, then all of this antisocial behaviour and Portsmouth would be a nicer city to live in. I am not sure that unless you want to go a long way down an authoritarian route, that you will see quite the societal change just by having 10 or 20 more police officers and a little counter in Cosham High Street.
Oh, I think those are quite interesting extremes to try and draw together, but I don't know. So just to remind listeners or viewers that are watching us on screen, the QR code in the top left-hand corner of the screen is actually the link to the agenda for PCC's full council meeting. So if you want to read ahead, then you can, but also you'll see the link there for you to be able to watch the live webcast on Tuesday afternoon of the actual council meeting itself. So please do avail yourselves of that. So the next motion is from Councillor Graham Heaney and Councillor Charlotte Gerada, who are from the Portsmouth Labour Group. So they're calling for to save Portsmouth Stroke Recovery Service. So their motion talks about there being 1.2 million stroke survivors in the UK, and how stroke can impact anyone at any age and any time, and it's actually the fourth biggest killer in the UK. Portsmouth City Council has funded the Stroke Recovery Service, delivered by the Stroke Association, for 14 years, the stroke survivors and their families have raised concerns about the planned closure of the Portsmouth Stroke Recovery Service, which was announced in April this year, for closure in June. So there was a short temporary extension announced in May to extend it till the end of December. But essentially, this motion is pointing out that this service is a lifeline to memory. It's a lifeline to many, and that Portsmouth residents should receive adequate support and access to vital services after a critical illness, and is calling on the council to extend its funding to the Stroke Recovery Service for the next 5 years. and to review its budgets and consider the wider financial, economic, and social and well-being impact of closing the service. That impact that would have on local services such as mental health, social housing, and adult social care. So I guess it's trying to make the case that, you know, if you trim this, where do those people that need that help end up showing up elsewhere in the system? And it's calling on the council to further investigate and fully understand what the service provides stroke survivors and their families, as the programme is not something that can be found in other services or the NHS. So I guess for me, kind of the kind of, if this is something that really, really works, where's the call to champion that? It's good that we've got that as a local thing, and that's been going for this period of time. Obviously, that the council, that the administration will have a response about whether that's something they can look to continue the funding of or deal with. But if it's that good, then shouldn't that be something that we're championing? You know, that someone should be writing a letter to, you know, someone should be surely calling on one of our city's MPs to make that a more widespread thing across the country, and then maybe get that funded by the NHS instead of by the local council. I don't know.
Well, and I think this is one of those awful situations, isn't it, Simon, where you've got something that is valuable and useful, but it falls in between the cracks. You know, it's not the NHS, it's not adult social care, so it sort of falls to the third sector with council support. And I think this is a really difficult one, because, you know, without knowing in depth what the service provides and what it costs, it's very difficult to comment. I do find it, you know, a little bit frustrating that, you know, council budgets were only agreed back in February. So, you know, if this was, you know, if closure was announced in April, then for me, if this was such a valuable service, then, you know, it's got to get into the budget, but there's an element of the money's got to come from somewhere else. You know, there isn't infinite money. So I kind of would have loved this motion to have, you know, and I'm a little bit, you know, like the previous one, kind of harking back to what should have, might have happened. There's a part of me that says, well, why wasn't this raised in February?
Well, that's, I mean, even before February, because that was the full council budget meeting. Was then, but the conversations about funding take place in the run up to that. So it's an interesting point. Obviously, it'll be interesting to see what the administration's response is. I guess there's simple there's always the temptation for the simplistic thing is this is I'm sure a worthy, valid, and useful cause. The question is, where can if the funding for this is budgeted to end in December, where can the money be found in order to extend that? So, you know, again, that'll be interesting to see what the administration say.
Yeah, and I think that's what we can't comment on this one more than that, really, Simon, because there's an element of, you know, well, if the money's now there to December, effectively, if everyone believes this is a good thing, we've got to find the money to get it from December to April, and we make you know, all parties make sure that it is a line item on the budget for, you know, for next year. So we'll see what happens with that one.
Indeed, we shall watch it closely. So the next thing on the agenda, so 10C, the motion there from George Fielding and from Mary Vallely from Labour, both from Labour, is about continuing support for Portsmouth Pride. Now, in our recent episode that we had looking at the week after Pride, and we had Tully on, who was a member of the team organising Pride. One of the things that she'd mentioned was of course that Portsmouth Pride is one of the few Pride events that's actually not a fenced event. Is not, you know, there's not charge to it. It's free to attend. the motion here cites that there's been a sharp increase in hate crime towards LGBT plus people, in particular towards the trans community in recent years, with homophobic hate crimes more than doubling, and with transphobic hate crimes increasing by 240% in the last 12 years. But in Portsmouth, from 2017, where an estimated 500 people attended Portsmouth Pride, this year we're an estimated 30,000. So certainly a very, very successful event. And indeed, we'd commented on that in the show. And in South Hampshire, there are 5 Pride events, and Portsmouth Pride is the only large-scale event that is free and unfenced. So this motion is calling for the cabinet to formally commit to making a financial contribution to Portsmouth Pride Trust as one of their 4 main partners. So that's an interesting thing, one of their 4 main partners for at least the next 5 years. So Portsmouth City Council aren't the only organisation that's the source of the funding for the event, but is a contributor towards it. And requesting that the Cabinet explores the possibility of including Portsmouth Pride as a line item in the budget, to provide security and consistency for Portsmouth's LGBT plus community, and to request that the leader of Portsmouth City Council and all group leaders write to Portsmouth Pride trustees and volunteers to thank them for all their hard working, making Portsmouth a visible destination for LGBT plus people in the southeast. So again, this is it's calling for for the council, for the administration to make a response in order to make a financial commitment. But this one is slightly different in the sense that it's not the council that are wholly funding this. Obviously, they're only one of 4 contributors to the event.
Yeah, and this is a tricky one for me, Simon, because there's absolutely no doubt about how the Pride event has grown. It's very popular. It is it appears to be a large community event. But there's an element of what is Portsmouth Pride? Is it a community event? Tally on the show basically phrased it as a protest movement. And for me, if it's a community event, then I think it's fundable in the way that all different community events are fundable. If it's a protest movement, I'm not sure that it's the role of council to fund protest movements.
I mean that's one point of view. I mean, I feel that it would be, and again, obviously the administration will give their response, but I think it's important that the council does what it can to provide an opportunity for the demonstration that Portsmouth can be a safe place for members of the LGBT plus community, and therefore is encouraging that community and that event celebration for the nature of that commitment. It's a fantastic event, obviously very, very successful, with lots of people attending, but very, very large event, and in that case, personally, I'd like to see it continue as a free event. It would be a shame that it becomes something that has to be ticketed, because I think that diminishes the power that it has in bringing the community together. But we'll see what the administration have to say.
Yeah, no, and I think there is an element of, obviously it is the exception, not the norm, for it to be a free event. As I say, it is and again, don't take my sentiments as being anything other than it seems to be a very popular event. Again, there's another little bit of me though that is doing we agreed the budget from April the 1st. And by mid-July that's 2 motions now to add 2 lines to the budget that all the parties agreed on only not that many months ago.
And that's an interesting point, because what does that kind of highlight from a perspective of how the budgetary negotiation goes on between the various groups and the council, when that conversation starts, what sorts of things are included in it, and is it are we now at the point where every year basically you're in for want of a better words a financial bun fight in order to kind of secure an agreement for the budget for the next financial year, but perhaps not necessarily kind of looking to the long term? Is that
Well,
a demonstration of poor planning, or is that just a demonstration of you don't, the things are so dire financially that you don't have a chance to take a more longer term view, and therefore you are ending up in a situation where you're firefighting? But I would have thought it's quite logical to challenge and point out things that are due to end or expire or change in the current financial year that you're discussing, because that's what the point of the budget debate is. That's what the point is of that whole conversation that takes place in that budget round.
Absolutely, and the danger for me is politicking, isn't it? And again, we've seen that in the past, and I think it wastes time at council. Again, I got frustrated for a couple of years with Labour calling on the Lib Dem administration to pay the living wage to every, as a minimum to every person. And the Lib Dem administration explained how they couldn't do that without massively cutting services. But that kept coming back, under the banner of the Lib Dems don't want to pay people a living wage. So, yeah, a little bit of politicking, perhaps. Both very worthy causes in this case. What have we got next on the list?
So next on the list, so 10D is improving accessibility in Portsmouth taxis for disabled people. So another motion from Charlotte Gerada and Yinka Adeniran from Portsmouth Labour. So this one's talking about over 1 in 5 people in the UK are disabled. That's over 14 million across the country. And in Portsmouth, there are nearly 17,000 people who have a disability or long-term health condition that limits their day-to-day activities a lot. There's a further 23,000 people who have a disability or long-term health condition that limits their day-to-day activities a little. So that equates to 19% of people in Portsmouth who have some sort of disability or long-term health condition that meets the definition of a disability under the Equalities Act 2010. There's a Portsmouth Disability Advisory Group that was established in 2022, which I'm sure you can speak of in a minute. And many people who use wheelchairs or mobility scooters have spoken of their difficulties accessing transport in the city, including taxis. It talks about everyday journeys to work, to school, to see families and friends, and to access essential services like healthcare. Are fraught with uncertainty for many disabled people. And although there are taxis operating in the city that can accommodate wheelchairs and drivers who are willing to assist, this seems to be in a limited supply, and there not being enough, especially accessible taxis during peak periods. And it goes on to mention that 99% of buses, for example, now meet the minimum accessibility standards, but the proportion of wheelchair accessible vehicles in the taxi fleet is 58%, and 2% for private hire vehicles, and these figures have actually been falling since 2014. So it goes on to point out about disability organisations who highlight how disabled people are disabled by society as a consequence of their impairment, and a consequence is that disabled people can unnecessarily be isolated and therefore excluded. So it calls on the licensing committee to commission a review into the level and availability of wheelchair accessible taxis in the city. Such a review to be undertaken and reported on within this municipal year. So that's before next May, including its policy that may limit or control the number of Hackney carriage vehicle licenses it issues, with the aim of improving licensing policy to increase accessibility for taxis, accessibility in taxis for disabled people, and to ask the licensing committee to explore and report on how it can increase the take-up of disability awareness training for taxi drivers in the city, and also ask group leaders to attend meetings with members of the Disability Advisory Group, and also to ask the leader to invite members of the Disability Advisory Group to the Transport Liaison Group to improve collaboration between transport providers and disability representatives, which seems an eminent sensible proposition. So,
So, full disclosure, I am a member of the Disability Advisory Group, and I have been communicating with Charlotte on this motion. So, it is a problem, and it's a problem in a number of dimensions. There's a lot of focus here on wheelchair accessible vehicles, and there is a shortage. There is also a bit of digital exclusion going on. We effectively are a taxi duopoly in Portsmouth. There's Uber or Aqua. Both of them primarily now operate on a smartphone kind of computer basis rather than you picking up the phone and booking a taxi. So there are a lot of issues here, and I think Charlotte's tapped into something which is a very real problem for a lot of disabled people. I think there's also the dimension of, one of the challenges of running a wheelchair accessible vehicle is if you are an owner driver, they are by their very nature larger vehicles, they are more expensive to run, and as is appropriate, you can't charge disabled people more for the same journey. So I think there's lots of things to explore here. I think there is, I will take my hat off to Charlotte for bringing this one forward. In fact, I think there's so much in this one. My hope is that in our autumn season, we'll be able to get Charlotte and perhaps a couple of my fellow DAG members on to the show, and we'll give this one a deep dive. But I think initially, starting this whole unpicking of accessibility for transport in Portsmouth, I think is a really good move.
okay, so yeah, hopefully we can talk with some positive news about that in future.
Yes.
But yeah, I don't think surely there's nothing in that one that
No.
anybody can disagree with.
No.
So I think that's going to be
no. Sadly, I was asked to go and make a deputation to council, which would have been my first on Tuesday, but unfortunately work commitments means that I couldn't be there. But yeah, I know fellow member of DAG who's a wheelchair user is going to go down and talk. So and I think there is that all of the group leaders, I would hope, will get fully behind this.
Indeed. So the next one is 10F, which 10E. Sorry, beg your pardon. I've got my
So we've got E and F to go, have we? And then the little
yeah. So 10E, armed forces and cost of living crisis. So put forward by Yinka Adeniran and George Fielding from the Labour Party. So obviously with the city's strong naval tradition, there's a strong active service and veterans of service linked to the city, and it talks about there being deeply concerning that service personnel in Portsmouth are being forced to turn to food banks, and concerning that charities and regimental associations continue to have to provide cost of living grants and food vouchers to veterans and their families. So it calls on the council to ask the leader to write to the Secretary of State for Defence to release the Armed Forces Pay Review Board for 23-4, which I think actually might have been announced was it one of the pay review bodies that actually was announced in the last week? So since this agenda was posted, I think there might have been a development on that.
Yep.
But it also asks for, because it talks about that being overdue, but it also asks about additional basic financial support to service personnel by capping food and accommodation charges for the next 12 months, and asks the leader to write to Portsmouth-based food banks and local forces charities to thank them for supporting armed forces personnel and veterans. So again, I don't think that's going to be one that anyone's going to be spending any time disagreeing with.
No, it's one which I find, of course, we're going to thank those in the third sector that support such work. So no one, you're not going to vote against it, but there's an element of writing to the Secretary of State. Any motion for which that's the principal aim, I struggle with it as gesture politics. It's look, we're doing something. Again, nobody's going to vote against it, but is it going to make a material difference? I'm not sure that it will.
Well, we will see, but obviously the council doesn't decide those things, but
No.
its leader sending a letter to the minister responsible in Westminster would hopefully carry some sort of credence and some sort of relevance, and some sort of add some sort of volume to the voices of those it seeks to help. So we hope so. So 10F, unauthorised encampments. So by Ryan Brent and Matthew Atkins from the Conservative group. This is calling on the council basically to form a cross-party working group with the remit of ensuring all Portsmouth City Council-owned land that's at risk of unauthorised encampments is adequately protected from future incursion, and calls on it to report via Cabinet back to the council within 3 meetings, so by December council. So it's again note that kind of most of these are, I'm finding it interesting to see that that's quite a development over the last couple of years, that they're being more specific about the timescales for these things happening, because otherwise it must be a tendency for them to drift. That it looks at the location and duration of all PCC land unauthorised encampments within the last 7 years, breakdown of the costs associated to the council services for each event, and what preventative measures have been put in place as a response to such incursions, and to engage in some consultation and support conducted with residents in the locality and timeframe of both. So, again, these things are happening. What's the council doing about them? What record is there of them? I think that'll be an interesting thing to have reported back and understand what the size and the severity of that concern is, which I guess is the point of having a report.
Yes, and to be honest, this is one where when I initially read it, I thought it was more gesture politics, a bit of red meat being thrown to those on the right of politics. But actually, when you read it through, it is more measured, and it's it is an element of the council officers play this across the whole region, play this cat and mouse game with unauthorised encampments, and look to get them moved on, and there is inevitably some clean up afterwards that the council taxpayers of Portsmouth will pick up, those in the encampments obviously not paying council tax and not paying it in Portsmouth. So there is very much an element here of understanding the size and scope of the issue, and the question of, could we do more to stop the good people of Portsmouth having to pick up these costs? Seems like a reasonable ask.
Yeah, indeed. These all seem like reasonable things. To be asking in that respect, and asking the cabinet to report back on what its findings are. Again, entirely useful for future discourse. So we'll see what comes back from that one as they come back later in the year.
So looks to me, if we look at it holistically, that there's going to be, I can't see there being too much contentious in there, to be honest.
No, I think with some of them, there might be with some of the motions there might be some disagreement here and there, but I think by and large, yes, everybody would want to make sure that those services have their funding extended, or that Pride has its contribution funding extended. There might be some that disagree with that, but it's I think by and large, the most of those things are calling on the council to be doing things or looking into things and reporting back. So in that sense, I don't see that's going to get a lot of objection.
Nope. So that brings us on to our last fascinating topic, which isn't a notion of motion, but how would we describe it?
Yeah. So the last one that we wanted to look at is actually item 9 rather than one of the notices of motion. But this one is there was a report or a letter given to cabinet that this point is basically reporting back to full council to discuss. But it's an application from the NHS trust at QA, who are currently having having their a new emergency department built, asking for Portsmouth City Council to effectively waive the community infrastructure levy. So just to remind viewers, that's the charge. So the levy that any developer has to pay a contribution towards, based on the there's all sorts of categorizations and tables as to how that's worked out. Has to make with any sort of development that they're making within within a city, and that usually goes to the ward in which that development sits. Although it may not be the case that all of that actually goes to specifically to the ward. But essentially, QA are on the hook for about £500,000 worth of community infrastructure levy contribution because of the new emergency department, and they're asking the council to waive it so that they can spend that £500,000 contributing towards a £900,000 CT scanner that they'd like to that they want to actually install.
I think this is absolutely outrageous. I am spitting mad from Cosham at this one, because I went away and did a little bit of digging, and the new accident and emergency department is a £58 million development. So the infrastructure levy is about 1% of the total budget, and I think the behaviour of the Portsmouth NHS Trust here is I'm going to go as far as disgraceful, because effectively it is looking Portsmouth City Council in the eyes and saying, well, you could take this money off of us, but there wouldn't be we need a scanner. I think it's verging on moral blackmail, Simon. I am. The more I've thought about this one, the more incensed I've become.
I do find it difficult to deal with things when you sit on the fence so much.
Yeah, well, neutrality is often my middle name, but in this case, I am angry from Cosham, because let's be honest, the ward in which QA sits is Cosham. So Portsmouth City Council is being asked to give away the Cosham and Wimmering's CIL money. Well, thanks. Brilliant. Cheers for that.
Well, I mean, just to clarify, this isn't this is reporting back to the council, to full council, it's asking them for the decision. And my understanding, I'm not aware that the councillors in the ward concerned, which are our councillors because we both live in the ward.
Yep.
So talking about disclosure there, we're not aware of them being against it, but we understand that the administration has written to the trust to say this can't happen again, because the hospital doesn't just serve the people of Portsmouth, it serves people from a wider area. And I guess that kind of speaks to a point that, when we look at when we look at look at the motion there about funding the stroke recovery service.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll pay for it using the £500,000 that Portsmouth Hospital Trust owes us. Let's link the two together. Give us our £500,000 and we'll spend it on the stroke recovery service.
I'm sure the stroke recovery service would dream of such a level of funding. I don't know how much their funding is, but I'm sure it's probably not that much. But I think there's an element here of actually, is that by planning or is that by design that that's not already taken into consideration? Surely it can't be a surprise to an organisation like an NHS Trust that community infrastructure levy exists and that they would need to contribute to it. I mean, you could argue that that's one part of, if you like, national infrastructure. So the NHS essentially giving money to a local council. But the reverse is happening here is actually that local council will be it's being asked to have made a decision to deprive itself of that funding, because the right thing for the people of Portsmouth and the people that the hospital serves is, of course, that there's a replacement CT scanner installed. But it strikes of how the funding model works for our local and national government, that it pits priorities against each other and in a competing sort of sense. So I think it speaks to a wider malaise in how those funding models work.
Well, I didn't. No, I'm going to disagree, because there's an element of, all politics is about tensions, isn't it? And often in the 4 years we've been doing this, it's financial tensions about what do you choose to spend your money on, and how do you choose to raise the money that you need to spend on stuff. And so I think you're correct in that sort of wider framework. There will be tensions, but for me, again, as somebody who's worked on capital projects in the past and is still working on them now, if a 58 million pound capital build project is going to have uncertainty in it, it is, you are not going to 3 years out have priced up the cost of nuts and bolts and screws and all of the above. You have to put a contingency on top. And for me, if you've spent all your contingency and you haven't got the money left over for a scanner, they will be in different budgets. The capital budget to build a building will not be the same as the capital budget to buy more scanners. And so I think the conflation of the two by Portsmouth Hospital Trust, as I say, I'm at the moral blackmail point on this. And I also think that our councillors have a duty of care to say no to this, because I will find it mass hypocrisy if everybody votes for this, if there is a vote, and waves it through. And then when we get to 10B about the stroke recovery service, if everybody starts making clucking noises and stroking their collective beards metaphorically, and says, oh yeah, we'd better find more, we need to find more money from the budget that we've already agreed. You have the bloody money. Portsmouth Hospital Trust owes you the money. Get them to pay the bloody bill. Use the money to pay for the stroke recovery service.
I get the point that you're trying to make. Just to clarify, I don't think you can actually use community infrastructure levy funding for those sorts of things. It has to be very specific things, and it's usually things rather than someone's wages, for example.
Revenue cost. Yep.
So again, like you were saying earlier, these are different line items in someone's budget. So one's about capital expenditure and investment in physical resources and infrastructure, and the other one's a completely different level or a different line item of your equipment expenditure. So I don't know enough about this to understand how the hospital trust got to its point where suddenly it realised that actually, oh, hang on a minute, we haven't got this £500,000.
Yep.
I can't believe that they didn't factor that into their calculations in the first place. So why, are they, to be blunt, are they just chancing their arm because this is something that they might be able to get cut because other costs have risen during the course of the project that mean that that's gone beyond their whatever contingency that they might have had. Obviously, we don't have someone from the trust on the show to be able to put their right of reply in and to kind of respond to that. So it will be. I don't think this is actually a decision item. I think this is just a reporting item. So I think the decision on this is done.
Wow.
So in that respect, that's but it is an interesting point. I think we've taken different points about why it's interesting and how it's interesting. But for me, it's from a taxpayer's perspective, taxpayers aren't necessarily as aware of to which entity they're paying their tax and what that tax is spent on. And the council is being asked, in this case, to effectively subsidise something that should be being paid for by national government.
Oh, absolutely. And it is the piece sometimes I do struggle with, in terms of, as you say, if this is just a report to say, yeah, sorry, we gave the £500,000 back because we didn't really need it. I'm going to find it. I find it very difficult then for people to be sucking air through their teeth that the two items that say, please, can we have some more money for X and Y? Yeah, and I get they're in different pots, they're in different funding. But yeah, no, I've become increasingly unhappy with this one as the weekend's gone on. Maybe it's the effect of the motorcycles.
Maybe so. I don't know. I thought they were cars, to be honest with you. I didn't think they.
No, they're motorcycles. They're motorcycles.
Oh, Christ. Okay.
Yeah.
Well. Okay. So yeah, that kind of takes us through our whistle stop tour of the agenda. So we'll see what happens on Tuesday. We'll have an ear pasted to that to understand how those things kind of went. But
I guess that's as we're starting to get towards that end of term feel, aren't we? I think that I think Parliament rises on Thursday. They've seen enough, so they're going to go off on their holly bobs, and I think we have to wait for another full council meeting till, am I right, mid-September?
This is where he hurriedly gets his calendar out.
Sorry, wasn't trying to throw you under the bus. I think we can agree that we know that nothing is going to happen in August. So like Parliament and the council.
Yeah, the next full council's in October.
Wow. But we're going to work harder than that, aren't we? So we will be taking our summer break, as we do after next week's show, which, as I say, is a must watch. With Steve Pitt, and we're then going to take the rest of August, the rest of July, all of August, and we'll come back sometime in early September to delight you with our insightful picking over of the bones of local and national politics.
Indeed. I mean, the interesting thing will be next week, obviously, that being after the full council meeting's taken place, where Steve basically schools both of us on how we've utterly misinterpreted the situation on that one. So I look forward to us maybe being wrong on that one, and we'll see what the outcome is, and we'll see how that one lands.
Marvellous. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Do join us next week, 6:27. Like, follow, subscribe, wherever you're finding us, on Facebook or on YouTube, so that you make sure you don't miss out on our next show.
On Threads.
Or we're even on Threads. So yes, do follow us for there, just to make sure you don't miss out on any of your notifications. I've not honestly been drinking. It's only tea and water I've got here. So we'll see you next week at 6:27, where we hear from the esteemed Steve Pitt.